In a city built to remember, one man moved through the crowd like he wasn't supposed to exist. No medals on his chest, no camera crews, no one waiting to shake his hand, just a faded patch on an old jacket, and a name nearly lost to silence. This is not a story about war. It's a story about coming home, and what happens when the world forgets the ones who do. His name was Walter Henley, and for years, he showed up, quietly, faithfully, to a museum that didn't remember him, until one moment changed everything. Washington, D.C. in early November held the kind of chill that crept in quietly. No snow yet, just wind between the brick buildings and leaves crunching beneath hurried shoes. It was a city of movement, of sharp lines and sharper intentions. But not everyone moved quickly. Walter Henley, 78, lived alone in a second-floor walk-up near Columbia Heights. His apartment was small and forgettable, chipped paint, creaking floorboards, a window that barely closed all the way. But it was enough. It had always been enough. Every morning, Walt woke at 5:30. No alarm, just his body, still on a soldier's rhythm. He brewed black coffee in an old dented kettle and stood on its tiny balcony watching school buses groan past the corner. He didn't have a smartphone, didn't text, didn't like talking on the phone much either. The world had gotten louder, faster, flashier, and Walt had gotten quieter in return. He wasn't invisible, not exactly. But in a city like D.C., stillness sometimes looked like absence. That morning, Walt wore his usual pressed flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a weathered brown field jacket. The kind that had seen more than one battlefield. The kind that made people wonder but rarely ask. On his left sleeve, barely hanging on by the threads, was the patch, 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, a symbol that once meant everything. He took the Metro's blue line downtown. He didn't read, didn't scroll, just sat quietly. One hand resting on the curve of his wooden cane, the other tucked into his jacket pocket. The city rolled past him in blurred fragments. His destination was the Veterans Heritage Museum, nestled near the National Mall, shadowed by larger, shinier buildings. Walt didn't go for the ceremonies or the speeches. He went for the wall. Each year, during Veterans Week, he sat quietly in front of the museum's memorial wall. Black glass etched with the names of those who never made it back. It didn't take photos, didn't talk, just sat remembering. When he walked through the museum's automatic doors, they hissed shut behind him. The air inside was colder than outside, cleaner. A young woman at the front desk looked up from her tablet, her expression polite but distant. "Good morning, sir," she said. "Timed entry only today. Do you have a ticket?" Walt stepped forward slowly. "No, I've come here every Veterans Week since the museum opened. Just wanted to sit for a moment." She hesitated, tapped her screen. Another staff member, younger, leaned in and whispered something too low to hear. But Walt recognized the look, one that said, "Not again. This guy just shows up to loiter." A moment later, a young security guard emerged from the side corridor. Broad shoulders, clean shave, jaw clenched like he had something to prove. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the premises." Walt looked up at him, eyes calm. "Why?" "You've been reported for loitering. This is a timed entry day. No walk-ins." Walt didn't argue. He didn't explain that he'd been coming for decades. Didn't describe the blood, the gunfire, the bunker collapse he once crawled out of. He didn't even mention the name Tom Garrison, a man he'd once pulled from rubble with a broken knee and a busted wrench. He simply reached across his body and adjusted his left sleeve, revealing the worn eagle patch on his jacket. The guard's hand paused on his belt, but before either man could move again, a voice rang out across the room, deep, sharp, still. "Where did you get that patch?" It wasn't a challenge, it was a memory. The entire lobby went still. Walt turned his head. At the entrance stood a man in full dress uniform, shoulders squared, chest lined with ribbons, 2 silver stars on his collar, a major general. He wasn't looking at the guard. He was staring at Walt, eyes fixed on the patch like it had come back from the dead. "The Gar," Walt nodded slightly. "Some ghosts wear camouflage. Others wear silence." The general stepped forward slowly, the lobby parting in his wake like a tide. No one dared speak. "You're Sergeant Walter Henley, aren't you?" the man asked, voice firm but reverent. Walt studied his face. There was something familiar in the lines around his mouth, the set of his jaw, but time had blurred it. "I am," he said. "And you are?" The general gave a ghost of a smile, half salute, half memory. Cole Garrison. My father was Captain Thomas Garrison. Walt blinked. Once. Twice. Then the years fell away. He remembered a photo. A younger Tom Garrison standing proudly beside a boy no older than 6. Bright-eyed, full cheeks. That photo had been in Tom's wallet. Something he'd shown Walt during a quiet hour in the jungle, back when they thought they might have a tomorrow to plan. "You're his son," Walt said, quieter now. "I am." The general looked down at the patch again. "My father told a story about a mechanic with a busted knee who dragged him half a mile under fire. Said he owed his life to a man who didn't wait for orders. Just got it done." Walt let out a single breathy chuckle. He always did like to exaggerate. The general shook his head, not smiling. "No," he said, "he didn't." Everyone in the lobby had fallen silent. Even the front desk clerk was watching now, face pale, hands still over her keyboard. The general turned to the young guard, whose hand was still hovering awkwardly near his belt. "You put your hands on a man whose service patch predates your birth. You might want to think a little harder about who you're speaking to." The guard swallowed. His face was crimson now. I'm sorry, sir," he muttered. It wasn't clear if he meant Walt, the general, or both. Walt raised the hand gently. "Let the boy be. He didn't know." The general's eyes didn't move. "That's the problem," he said. "Too many don't." Then he turned back to Walt, and something shifted in his posture, formality softening into memory. "Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Walt hesitated for only a moment. Then he nodded, and the two men, one aging quietly, the other carrying the weight of lineage, walked together into the Hall of Honor. No one stopped them. No one dared. They paused at the bench Walt had tried to sit on earlier. The general motioned to the wall of names beside it. "You belong here," he said, "more than any plaque we've ever printed." Walt didn't answer, but for the first time that day, a small private smile touched his face. Sometimes, being remembered isn't about noise. It's about being seen. The Hall of Honor had a particular kind of quiet. It wasn't sterile like a hospital or sacred like a church. It was a quiet made of breath held in reverence, a silence built brick by brick from memory. Walt's eyes moved over the wall of names. He never read them out loud. He just let them exist, as they were, as they had been. The general stood beside him, saying nothing for a while. He knew enough not to speak into the moment too soon. It was Walt who finally broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "your father used to hum when he was nervous. Never a full song. Just the first 5 notes of 'Take Me Home, Country Roads.' Over and over." Cole turned toward him. A flicker of surprise, or perhaps gratitude, passed across his face. "I never heard that story," the general said. "There are a lot of stories no one ever asked to hear," Walt replied. He slowly lowered himself onto the bench, hands resting atop his cane. The general sat beside him. "It was 72, Walt began, staring at the names without focusing. Kontum Province. Monsoon season had hit early. Everything was mud and rot and mosquitoes the size of small birds. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the front line. I was just a wrench guy, kept the transports alive. That's all. But war doesn't care where you're assigned. That day a call came through. Supply run gone wrong. The squad was pinned near a ravine, and their engine had blown halfway through. Walt had the only working jack and the only truck that wasn't underwater. I didn't think, I just drove," he said. Half the road had collapsed from the rain. The trees looked like they were bending to listen. You ever hear silence in a jungle? It's loud in its own way. Everything breathing, but nothing human. They'd found the squad hunkered in a natural trench, the engine disabled, the exit route gone. The plan had been to swap out the axle, get them moving before another mortar hit. But war has its own timing. A shell landed 15 meters from us, Walt said. Didn't hit directly, but the shockwave dropped part of the hillside on the trench roof. 3 of us were inside when it gave way. Tom, your dad, he was the furthest in. I was by the entrance. Ellis was in the middle. Corporal Ellis, Cole asked. Walt nodded. Bravest man I ever knew. Propped the beam with his back, legs shaking like matchsticks. Gave me just enough time to crawl in and reach your father. Tom's leg was caught under a beam. I didn't have tools, just instinct and a crowbar. He paused, swallowed once. The words felt heavier than they used to. I don't remember pain, even though I busted my knee getting him out. I just remember the sound of the beam cracking, Ellis yelling at me to move faster. And then, silence. The silence after a collapse is worse than the collapse itself. They've gotten Tom out. Ellis hadn't followed. I wrote his family once, didn't send it. I didn't know how to explain that he died so someone else could live. Walt leaned back slightly, eyes glazed with something older than memory. You know, the funny thing is, after we got Tom out, he reached for my hand, not to thank me, not to hold on, just to make sure I was still there. He didn't say anything, just squeezed once, that was enough. General Garrison sat still, his eyes on the wall. My father never talked about the war much, not to us. But I found his journal after he passed. There's an entry with your name. Said if we ever met you, we were to buy you a drink, hand you a wrench, and never ever call you a hero. Walt laughed once, low and raspy. Sounds like Tom. The general reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photo. It was creased and faded. 3 young men in olive fatigues, grinning like the world was still whole. Arms around each other, a jungle trail behind them. I found this in one of his boxes, he said. You're on the left, he's in the middle. Ellis on the right? Walt took the photo carefully, his fingers reverent. Yeah, he whispered. That was before we knew what the jungle could do to a man. For a moment, both men sat in silence. Not awkward, just full. You saved his life, Cole said finally. No, Walt said. I did what needed doing. It wasn't about saving anyone. It was about showing up. That's all I ever did. The general looked at him with something more than admiration. It was awe. You know, he said, I've given a lot of medals, shaken a lot of hands, but I think this is the first time I've ever met the man behind one of my father's legends. Walt's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Legends die, he said. People forget. But if someone remembers to ask, sometimes they come back. Washington was a city made for remembering. Every block carried plaques, busts, bronze figures, frozen in time. It honored legacies in stone, steel, and ceremony. But even in a place built to remember, it was possible to forget the living. Walt returned home that evening the same way he always did, by foot, 2 blocks from the metro, his cane tapping rhythm against the sidewalk. The streets were wet with recent rain, reflecting red brake lights and the shimmer of office windows. He passed a couple arguing quietly, a food truck closing up, a delivery bike swerving past without apology. No one noticed the old man in the brown field jacket. Not really. He stopped at the corner diner, Marcy's place. It said in chipping red letters above the door. Inside, it smelled like fried eggs and burnt coffee, the same way it had for decades. Familiar in a way nothing else in the city was. Marcy was at the counter, late 40s, sharp eyes softened by long hours and good instincts. She didn't ask what he wanted. She just set out as usual. Dry toast, scrambled eggs, no salt, and a mug of coffee darker than night. Thanks, Marcy, Walt said. Any trouble at the museum? She asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He paused. A little, but it worked itself out. She didn't press. That was what Walt liked about her. Marcy had never called him sir, just Mr. Henley, which somehow felt like a bigger show of respect. The booth, in the back, his booth, looked out over the sidewalk. Walt sat there slowly, his knees creaking a little louder than last week. He didn't rush, didn't bring a book, just sipped his coffee and let the world slide by outside the window. Later, when he returned to his apartment, the street was quiet. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and someone's forgotten takeout. The elevator didn't work, but it hadn't for years. Inside, his home was clean but sparse. No television, just books lined on sagging shelves, a radio on the counter, and a single box in the closet he hadn't touched in a long time. He opened it that night. Inside, a bronze star in its case, a few grainy photographs, smiling faces now lost to time, and a letter, creased and yellowed, addressed but never sent. He unfolded the letter slowly. His handwriting had been tighter back then, more certain. To the family of Corporal Ellis, I wish I had the right words. I can only say that your son stood when others fell, that he held up a piece of the world, and in doing so, saved others. I was one of them. I owe him every breath I still take. Walt stopped reading. He refolded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Some things didn't need to be said out loud, but they still needed to be kept. He sat for a while in his armchair by the window, the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the floor. He watched people walking home late from work, coats pulled tight, heads down, and he wondered, not bitterly, just honestly, how many stories walked unnoticed beside them every day. The next morning, as he stepped outside, something caught his eye, a small sign tucked under the awning of the museum's front steps. It was handwritten, not typed, on plain white cardstock taped to a wooden stake. To Sergeant W. Henley, we apologize. Your seat is reserved. He stared at it for a long time. Later, he found a folded card resting on the bench inside the Hall of Honor. On the front, it said, "Welcome back." Inside, in blue ink, were just two words, "We remember." He didn't need to know who wrote it. That night, he sat on his porch again. This time, the bulb above his door glowed strong and steady. Someone, maybe the superintendent, maybe the universe, had finally fixed the wiring. Walt chuckled quietly, muttered something about miracles in small packages, and settled into his chair. The street was alive again. A kid on a bike whipped past, tires hissing on wet pavement. A woman walking her dog gave a small nod. Someone held the elevator door for an old man across the street. Small things. But this time, Walt noticed that they noticed him. He wasn't being celebrated. He wasn't being applauded. He was being seen. And in a city full of statues and speeches, that was enough. The knock came just after dusk. Not the hard, impatient kind. Just two soft taps. Like someone wasn't sure if they were welcome. Walt sat in his armchair near the window, a worn library copy of The Things They Carried open in his lap. He didn't move at first. He hadn't had a visitor in weeks, maybe longer. Another knock. He set the book down, adjusted his flannel shirt, and moved toward the door slowly. His knees still gave him trouble some days, a souvenir from the jungle he never tried to return. When he opened it, a young man stood there, maybe early 20s, hoodie pulled up halfway, a messenger bag slung across his chest, and a nervous energy that didn't belong on the street after dark. "Mr. Henley?" he asked. Walt tilted his head slightly. "Yes." The young man held out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. "I think this is you." Walt took it carefully. His hands, though steady, trembled at the edges with the kind of caution born from seeing too much. The headline read, "Local Mechanic Saves 6 in Tunnel Collapse, Bronze Star Award." Below it, a photo from 1972, a much younger Walt, streaked in mud, standing beside a battered armored transport. His face was calm, eyes wide, unflinching, alive. Walt exhaled through his nose. He hadn't seen that article in over 40 years. "I found this in my grandfather's collection," the young man said. "He passed a few months ago. He used to tell me about a guy who rebuilt an engine under mortar fire, said that's how he made it home. He never mentioned your name. But the unit patch, the timing, it all lines up." Walt looked at him then, really looked. "You his grandson?" The young man nodded. "Name was Donald Meyer, Corporal, 101st Airborne. Served with a guy named Garrison, said he owed his life to a wrench guy." Walt leaned against the doorway, the weight of recognition settling on his shoulders like an old pack. "Donald. Yeah, I remember him. Took a piece of shrapnel to the thigh and still tried to carry his buddy out. Tough kid. Point. My grandfather always said he wasn't the hero in the story," the young man said. "He said the hero was quiet, kept his tools clean, and didn't wait for orders." Walt chuckled softly. "That sounds about right." The boy shifted on his feet. "I'm doing a project, for school, oral history. We're supposed to write about someone whose story didn't make the history books, someone who mattered anyway." Walt narrowed his eyes slightly. "And you came looking for me?" "I figured, if I could find the man in this photo, I could find the story he didn't tell." Walt glanced at the article again, then back at the young man. For a moment, he considered saying no, considered closing the door gently, like he'd done 100 times before. But something in the kid's eyes, not hunger for glory, but hunger for truth, made him pause. "Come in," he said. The apartment was simple. No TV, a few framed photos, none of Walt himself. A coffee mug still warm on the table. A file box in the corner, marked Personal, 1970s. The young man stepped inside carefully, as if the floor held echoes. "Would you mind if I recorded?" he asked, holding up a small voice recorder. Old school, no apps involved. Walt considered, then nodded. Just don't edit me into someone I'm not." The young man smiled. "Wouldn't dream of it." They sat. Walt told the story, not just of the collapse or the wrench or the mud, but of the waiting, the watching, the letter he never sent, the quiet afterward that no one prepared him for. He didn't cry, didn't boast, he simply spoke. When he finished, the young man clicked off the recorder and sat back. His expression changed, more reverent, more rooted. "I'm gonna write this right," he said. "Not for a grade, just because it should exist." Walt nodded once. That's all we ever wanted. As the boy stood to leave, he turned at the door. "By the way," he said, "I read something you might like. From a poet, I think." He said, "Some men leave footprints you don't see until they're nearly gone." Walt didn't reply. Just let the words settle into the room like dust finding a home. After the door closed, he sat back down and looked again at the newspaper photo. He picked up a sticky note, wrote 2 words on the back, and stuck it to the frame. Still here. Legacy didn't arrive like a brass band. It crept in quietly, like the first light before dawn. After the gathering, Walt returned to his routines, though something in the air felt different. Not louder, just noticed, as if the city had finally stopped walking past him. At Marcy's diner, they didn't charge him for coffee anymore. But she didn't make a big show of it either. She just poured, slid over the mug, and gave him a nod like she always had. "You were always good to us," she said once, resting a hand briefly on the counter. Walt raised his eyebrows. "You remembered?" "We just forgot to say it," she replied. "That's different." Outside the museum, the small wooden plaque beneath the bench had been replaced with something sturdier. Bronze, mounted cleanly into the stone base. Reserved, Sergeant Walter Henley, 101st Airborne, still standing. Veterans and visitors began to take notice. Some sat beside it in silence. A few older men saluted the space even when Walt wasn't there. No selfies, no hashtags, just a simple gesture, a stillness shared. One morning, as Walt sipped his coffee in the museum's garden, a young woman approached with a canvas tote bag over her shoulder and nervous energy in her steps. "Excuse me," she said, "are you Mr. Henley?" He looked up. "Depends on who's asking." She smiled. "I'm a grad student in oral history. My professor forwarded me the article from the high school newspaper." "The one written by Jack Meyer?" Walt nodded. "Good kid. His grandfather was one of mine. I'm writing a thesis on unrecorded acts of valor, not the ones with medals, the ones with silence." "I was hoping, well, if you're willing, I'd love to ask you a few questions." Walt motioned to the seat beside him. "If you're asking to listen, not to headline, I'm all yours." Over the next few weeks, a quiet rhythm formed. Students from nearby universities stopped by the bench, some with notebooks, others just with eyes wide open. A middle school history teacher brought her class to the museum and pointed to Walt's plaque, explaining not just what the war was, but who was left to carry it after it ended. One boy asked if Walt was famous. "No," his teacher said. "He's better. He's real." Walt didn't seek attention. He didn't suddenly decide to speak on stages or lead any causes. He still drank the same bitter coffee, still wore the same jacket, still walked with the same slow pace through the morning mist. But he was no longer invisible. One day, General Garrison returned. No uniform, just a navy sweater and the calm of a man who no longer needed titles to be heard. He joined Walt at the diner, and the two sat like they'd known each other longer than time admitted. "I looked up Corporal Ellis," the general said, stirring his coffee. "My father wrote about him in a letter home, said he held up the ceiling while others escaped." Walt nodded. "That tunnel wouldn't have held without him." "You were the one with the wrench." Walt smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter. He stayed. That's what counts." The general looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret not saying more?" Walt paused. "Every now and then. But most days, I think silence says more than noise ever could, if someone bothers to listen." Garrison nodded, as if storing the line for later. When they left the diner, Marcy slipped Walt an apple pie in a brown paper bag. "From the neighborhood," she said. "And from me." That afternoon, a group of high schoolers set up folding chairs around the museum's bench. No event, no sound system, just a circle of students who had read Jack's films and wanted to hear the story from the place it happened. Walt didn't speak. He sat quietly nearby. But the students noticed. One by one, they turned their chairs slightly, facing not just the plaque, but the man. A girl raised her hand, unsure why. "You don't have to ask," Walt said gently. "You can just talk." "Do you remember them?" she asked. He didn't need to ask who she meant. "I remember all of them," he said, "even the ones I tried to forget." Another boy asked what scared him most. "Coming home," Walt said without hesitation, "not because it was dangerous, because I didn't know if I'd still belong." He looked around the circle, at faces full of attention and wonder. "But sometimes," he added, "you come back to a place and it remembers you before you remember yourself." The students were silent for a long time. And then one of them did something small, something no one had planned. He placed a folded note beneath the bench. Just a scrap of notebook paper, barely legible, but Walt read it later when the crowd had gone. "Thank you for showing up. I will too." That night, Walt sat on his porch again. The porch light glowed steady overhead. A couple walked past and waved. The boy on the bicycle from last week skid to a stop and pointed. "My teacher read your story again. She said you didn't need medals. You were the story." Walt smiled. "She's a smart one." The boy grinned and rode off down the street, leaving a trail of autumn dust in his wake. Walt leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked, but it held, like it always had. And somewhere between the silence and the stories, a legacy lived. Not on a stage, not in stone, but on a bench, a breath, a boy's notebook, and the sound of someone remembering. By December, the trees in the city had shed their last leaves. The wind along the Potomac grew sharper, and people wrapped their scarves higher, walked faster, kept their heads down. Walt didn't walk any faster. He still took his time crossing the street, still nodded at the bus driver who stopped a little longer when he saw the cane. Still made his slow, deliberate way down the museum stone steps, even when the sky hinted at snow. Some days he stopped in, others he just passed by, but the bench was never empty for long. Sometimes a veteran sat in silence. Sometimes a student jotted down notes for a school report. Once, a woman left a bouquet of small white lilies in a mason jar. No name, no ribbon, just a quiet offering placed under his plaque. One afternoon, Walt returned home to find a young man waiting outside his apartment building. He looked familiar, and he was. The security guard from the museum. No uniform this time, just a wool coat and a nervous look on his face. He stepped forward, holding out his hand. "I was wrong, sir," he said. "Back then, I didn't know who you were, didn't try to." Walt shook his hand without hesitation. "You weren't supposed to know," he said. "But now you do. That's what matters." The young man looked down at his shoes, then up again. "I brought my dad last week. He was a medic in the Air Force. He wanted to shake your hand." Walt smiled. "He's welcome any time." The conversation didn't last long. It didn't need to. Like so many things in Walt's life, it wasn't about the words. It was about the showing up. That winter, the porch light outside Walt's apartment stopped burning out. For years it had flickered, dim, unreliable, more of a habit than a fixture. But sometime after the ceremony, it began to shine steady. Someone had fixed the wiring. No one told him who. It just stayed on. And every evening, Walt sat beneath it, flannel collar turned up, a warm mug in hand, radio low beside him, playing old jazz or static-filled baseball reruns. He didn't sit there waiting for anyone. But people came. Marcy from the diner brought pie every Friday. Said it was to clean out the... But it was always warm, always wrapped in string. A local college student came once with a notepad, just wanting to know what jungle humidity felt like. "It sticks to you," Walt had said. "Like memory." Even Jack Meyer, the high school kid who wrote the article, stopped by with a yearbook. Page 17 had a quote printed in neat type beside Walt's photo. "Some people talk about doing the right thing. Some people just do it." Walt didn't say anything when he saw it, just nodded and turned the page like it was any other name, any other face. But later, when Jack left, Walt placed the yearbook on the same shelf where he kept the photo of the 3 young men on the jungle trail. Him, Tom Garrison, and Ellis. He added a sticky note on the back of the frame. "Still here, still grateful." On the night snow finally came, it did so without noise. No wind, no thunder, just a hush settling over the city like a blanket pulled over tired shoulders. Walt stepped onto the porch and looked out at the quiet street. Across the road, A boy on a bicycle skidded to a stop and waved. "Hi, Mr. Walt." Walt raised his mug slightly in reply. "My teacher read your story in class again. She said you weren't loud like some of the other veterans, but that you still mattered." Walt smiled, his breath clouding the air in front of him. "She's a smart one." The boy nodded like he'd been given a secret, then kicked off into the snow-dusted night, his tires carving gentle curves behind him. Walt leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked beneath him, but it held, like it always had. He looked up at the porch light, glowing above him, warm and steady, no longer flickering. It wasn't waiting for anyone, but it was ready, just in case. 3 months later, when spring crept in, the museum added a new permanent exhibit, The Ones Who Came Home Quietly. It wasn't flashy, just a corner of the Hall of Honor with a restored bench, a few voice recordings, and a plaque dedicated to those whose courage came without ceremony, to those who returned and kept returning, not to be seen, but to remember. May we remember them too. Walt didn't ask for it. He didn't even visit the exhibit for weeks. But one morning, as the cherry blossoms started to bloom along the mall, he walked into the museum, nodded at the front desk clerk, who now stood when he entered, and made his way to the bench. He sat, adjusted his sleeve out of habit, and looked at the faces of passing visitors. Some stopped, some smiled, a few just nodded, not in recognition of fame, but of something else, something deeper. A man still standing, still showing up, still here.
This audio is made with Audio Toolkit for Windows Store, downloaded for free now.